So let's hope that people are slowly finishing the lunches and gathering here. I'm just testing the mic so that I'm getting attention. I do, right? Maybe I just start slowly because people will drop in and we'll spend some time in introductions. So this is a keynote speech by Professor Mounya Elhilali from where is she from? Johns Hopkins University. She will be telling us how to deal with the everyday situations. This is something which is Viborne. So at least I can test it again, right? So this is a session, a keynote speech by Professor Mounya Elhilali from Johns Hopkins University, and she will be telling us how to deal with everyday situations, how human beings or animals are doing it, and how maybe what are some implications for machine processing of speech.
Okay, so as Hinek said, Mounya Elhilali is from the electrical engineering department in Johns Hopkins University, but she also holds a joint appointment in the Department of Brain and Psychology. Is a member of the Center of Language and Speech Processing at Johns Hopkins, but also the Center for Hearing and Balance at the same place. She holds a PhD from University of Maryland in College Park. She has been awarded several prestigious awards, like the Office of Naval Research Young Researcher Award, has the NSF Career Award, and also was the name of Charles Wren Professor at the university. So as Hinek said, she will be talking about adaptive listening to everyday soundscapes. The talk is pre-recorded, but hopefully she will join us after the talk for live question and answers. So please.
Hello, everyone. Wanted to start with a special thank you to the organizers for the invitation to give this talk. And I wanted to start with really a simple observation that the world around us is a very noisy place. And while we don't often realize it, everyday communication is an amazing feat. Whether at home with our family, chatting with a friend at a cafe, or walking down a street, we're constantly surrounded by multiple sound sources. Even in these days of social distancing, sounds around us don't stop. Yet our brain has to parse through these multiple signals to allow us to communicate with each other and understand our surrounds. That is what is often referred to as the cocktail party problem, meaning the challenge that our brain faces when unpacking the cacophony of sounds that enter our ears at every moment in time and focus on sounds we're interested in while ignoring others. And so one of the critical tools that our brain uses to tackle this challenge is attention, meaning our ability to focus on one sound source and ignore others. And in fact, attention allows us to direct our biological searchlight, so to speak, to one sound or another based on what we judge is the most relevant information at that moment in time. So if we're crossing the street, we may need to be more alert to the sounds of passing cars or horns, while these same sounds may be merely a distraction if we're standing on the sidewalk just having a conversation with someone. So as we communicate and go about our lives, our brain's response to the same sounds is changing on a moment-by-moment basis as we decide what is important to listen to and what is not. And so we know, in fact, from many studies that we cannot process the entire mixture signal that enters our ears. And our brains have limited capacity in terms of how much information we can process. There are many experiments and known manifestations of this limited capacity, some that resulted in disastrous accidents. This is an example from a well-known aviation accident of a commercial flight, United 173, in the late 70s. The pilot was focusing his attention on a landing gear malfunction and preparing for the possibility of an emergency landing, that he failed to take note of an audio alarm alerting him to low fuel to all engines. This incident unfortunately resulted in a catastrophic landing with 10 casualties and many injuries. This is but one of many, many examples in both real life and in lab experiments that highlight that listening is not a simple mapping of the input signal to an output transcription, but it is a more active or engaged process where our expectations and goals shape how we perceive and map the input signal. So the term attention that I'm invoking here in the context of the brain bears a lot of parallels with its use in other domains, particularly in deep learning. So the idea of attention has recently revolutionized many DNN architectures, including use of transformers in domains spanning machine translation, computer vision, natural language processing, among others. And it is used to get the network to dial up weights or focus on certain aspects of the input and dial down other aspects that are not relevant, therefore selectively attending to different components of the input rather than giving the same computational capacity to all elements. In artificial networks, attention often takes on the role of a soft search process across the feature space, generally trained based on the distribution of the input information, along with context, which can then be applied locally or globally. However, in brain networks, selective attention manifests itself in a rather different way. It engages a broader brain network extending beyond sensory regions and invokes both learned distributions about the input as well as more direct interactions with priors or memories of sounds we want to pay attention to. So in the process, attentional selection in the brain is able to adapt transformations based on different objectives, facilitate robust encoding that adjusts to both goals and context, and continuously self-tunes the system to on the fly learn in a self-guided fashion. So as you're listening to this talk right now, and depending whether you are in a lecture hall or an office or at home, when you choose to listen to me talk, you're relying on your prior familiarity with English, your priors about human speech, in order to focus on my voice and ignore maybe background fans or chatter that may be near you. But your priors of speech are also informed by adaptive expectations as you become more familiar with my voice. You have a sense of what my pitch range is, what my natural syllabic rate is, my accent, as well as information about your surrounds if they happen to be dynamically changing. So as such, attention and learning work in a closed loop. Attention can guide what you learn about the world, and internal world models are used then to guide attention. So I should point out here that attention is not a unified concept, and the term is used very broadly to refer to various aspects going from vigilance, arousal, alertness, but here I will be mostly referring to selective task-driven attention. So throughout this talk, I will touch on a number of ways we know attention operates within the auditory system, and we'll focus on some of its rudimentary or elementary manifestations and how we can leverage these basic principles in computational models. So if we take a look at the auditory neural system by basically taking a vertical or coronal slice across the head right here, we know that when sound enters our ears, it goes through a number of processing stages that extracts information about the signal that enters our ears. So this is a simplified diagram of what this system actually looks like, and it's basically giving us an overview of different processing stages, starting from the outer ear all the way to the higher sensory and cognitive parts of the brain. And the main takeaway really from this diagram is that the brain is structured along multiple layers or processing stages in a recurrent yet still hierarchical fashion. So this is very much reminiscent of structures we often use in artificial neural networks, where the input gets mapped onto increasingly complex latent spaces. And if we take an analogy from neural networks, this hierarchical system is in fact a series of transformations where the input X is mapped onto gradually complex embedding spaces Z sub I through some mapping function parameterized by parameters phi. Right here. So now we take a look at one of the first critical stages of the processing hierarchy in the auditory pathway, namely at the level of auditory cortex, highlighted here in the red box, which is one of the really the first stages where we know that first images of sound start emerging. It is one of the early stages where our conscious perception of integrated auditory objects emerge. In fact, we know from legion studies in animals and cortical deficit cases in humans that auditory cortex is critical for the temporal organization of acoustic patterns and perceptual ordering of acoustic events. And a number of studies have shed light on the properties of individual neurons or individual nodes at the level of auditory cortex, which allow us to better understand the weight or activation functions of individual nodes in this layer of the brain. And these characteristic functions are typically mapped along time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis, allowing us basically to get a better view of how the incoming audio signal is filtered by different nodes at this level of the auditory pathway. So red regions typically correspond to excitatory areas or patterns that this neuron likes to respond to, and blue regions typically reflect what we call inhibitory regions or patterns that would shut down the response from this node, while green is basically a sort of baseline response. So if we look at a number of characterized filters or these mapping functions in auditory cortex from many, many studies, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of recordings of individual nodes over many studies, we know that these cortical properties or these sort of neural transfer functions, or what are referred to as receptive fields, come in many shapes and sizes. So this is an example of 6 different neurons that were recorded in primary auditory cortex of an awake ferret. So this function basically gives us the filter characteristics or the preferred spectral and temporal patterns that each of these 6 neurons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like to respond to. So in this first example, we see basically a transfer function or a neuron that likes to respond to fairly narrow band signals around 1 kilohertz with pretty fast temporal response span in 50 milliseconds. If we look at these other examples, we see a wide variety of response patterns, some that are narrow in time, some that are faster in time, some that are broader in time. Similarly, spectrally, we see some that span a broad spectral coverage, some that are very narrow, some that are oriented. So these are only few examples of the estimated billions of neurons or hundreds of millions of neurons that we know make up auditory cortex. And while it provides a simplified approximation, these tune-ins really reflect connection weights in the biological network and basically suggest that auditory cortex consists of many nodes that tile the incoming time frequency spectrogram with multiple resolutions. So effectively, we can imagine that what happens as the signal is analyzed at the level of auditory cortex is that a number of details are extracted with these multiple resolutions along time and frequency. So with this idea in mind, the question then we want to ask in today's talk is, how does attention affect this tiling process? What happens when we are tasked or choose to selectively attend to a specific sound amongst a cacophony of sounds that always surround us? So going back to experiments in animals where it is possible to record these kind of neural functions from individual nodes or individual neurons, many studies have now shown that these receptive fields change their features or tuning characteristics once we pay attention to a specific sound. So for example, when animals are asked or tasked to detect a specific frequency shown here in red, we see that an initial node that was tuned mostly in this area of 8 to 10 kilohertz, increases its response area to cover this particular 7 kilohertz tone that the animal is trying to respond to or pay attention to. This is another example of another task where the animal is trying to discriminate between 2 frequencies. And so again, we see these changes of the tuning properties of these nodes while the animal is performing the task. Similar changes are also observed when animals are tasked with more temporal or tasks that are more temporal in nature, such as detecting the presence of a gap in a sound or a silence in the middle of a sound. And so here we see that while the frequency response did not change, the temporal profile changed. Sort of the nodes are now responding a little bit earlier in time, similarly here with this temporal task. So overall, without really getting into the details of these experiments, what we're seeing is that these receptive fields change from an original passive state or their baseline state to adapt their response either along time or along frequency in order to facilitate the performance of the task. What is also more fascinating is that these nodes or these neurons eventually go back to their original state when we are no longer paying attention to the specific sound. So this is an example of a neuron that was recorded over the course of 3 hours. So first there was the animal was in a passive state, just sort of sitting there, not performing a specific task. Then it engaged in a task, and we see these changes where this blue region or this inhibitory region has disappeared, so is this red region, and then the animal goes back to a passive state, and so the neuron goes back to its original state. Then the animal was engaged in a second task after 2.5 hours, and again we see the neuron properties change, and then they go back to their original state. So together, these results really indicate that individual neurons in this vast web of millions of cortical neurons change their tuning properties on the fly, depending on the attentional goal of the organism at that specific moment in time, while maintaining or reverting to their stable state as needed. A number of other studies in human listeners have also corroborated these findings, and these are fascinating because they're really showing this ability of the system to really adapt on a moment-by-moment basis. And so what we wanted to explore and what I'm going to touch on in the next few slides is what, what are the theoretical implications of this kind of free tuning? So if we go back to our overview of auditory processing as a series of transformations where sound inputs are mapped onto representations of sound that represent targets that we may want to attend to, and background sounds that we may wish to ignore, shown here by this sort of representational statistical distribution of targets and backgrounds. The one way to interpret one of the roles of attention is that it is really changing the mapping function itself. And so now we are basically going to a new mapping function. Instead of this mapping function Q sub phi, it's a new mapping function parameterized by phi hat, where the feedback from this output is ultimately guiding which direction the mapping function has to be adjusted. And so that together enables the system to get a better discrimination between the target and the background that we're trying to ignore. So if we imagine an array of these neurons to represent a layer of these mapping parameters represented by a weight matrix W naught, we anticipate that the attentional feedback basically adjusts the weight matrix to some new matrix W sub T or sub target that reflects information about the target of interest to the system. So obviously this change has to also respect constraints, not to stray too far from the original matrix W naught. So we need to maintain some form of stability of the system. This is not something where you completely rewire your brain the minute you want to listen to a voice, but these are really micro changes locally at the level of each node so that globally the system is able to perform the selective attention task that you're trying to achieve. So we performed a quantitative study to answer the question of how does retuning the features themselves facilitate processing. And in other words, we're trying to get a better sense of what is the impact of changing the sensory mapping parameters phi. So to help us explore this question, we chose as a task voice activity detection in order to focus on speech signals and distinguish them from all non-speech signals. And this task was chosen really as a good fit to explore this question of retuning because it allows us to basically take the input signal, project it through a series of transformations and feature mapping to two statistical representations or two groups, and then we can then explore the discriminability between these two representations as we consider retuning of these feature mappings. And so in line with how attention operates in the brain as a feedback process that guides the adjustment of mapping filters, we also introduced a feedback loop that minimizes the risk of misclassification of the two classes and effectively retunes the filter parameters phi in order to maximize discriminability between speech tokens and all other sounds. And so this process is not quite similar to domain adaptation. I need to emphasize that in the sense that the statistical models are not adjusted. So once they are trained, these models are fixed. It's really the mapping function that is being adjusted to better map the signal to these two representations. And so really what attention is trying to achieve in this scenario is to adapt the different distortions or adapt to different environmental distortions or non-speech patterns that may overlap with speech in order to basically deliver to the statistical representation as clean a version of the signals as they expect. And so to do that, we are retuning, this retuning procedure is done with novel and seen data. And so it's not really a sort of a transfer learning or a remapping of the statistical representation of these two classes. And so in order to really understand what the filter retuning is achieving, we chose a set of parametric filters using an array of Gabor filters as shown here. So while these are not really optimal in any a priori way, we can independently control the parameters of these filters more individually. And so we can control the gain of these filters. Shown here, we can control their spectral and temporal span. We can control their orientation. And so what we're performing here is a form of basically optimization procedure that allows the gain alpha, the span sigma along time and frequency, and the orientation to undergo micro changes. So each of these filters is allowed to change locally in this part of this optimization procedure, with the goal to minimize the risk of this of a misclassification between speech and non-speech sounds. So by allowing these filters to adjust along all dimensions, we are basically performing a nonlinear transformation of these two tune-in filters with the goal to achieve our objective function, which is to maximize discriminability between speech and non-speech. So we tested this model before retuning and after retuning, and this is basically a plot of some of the results we can achieve with this model. And so this is a plot of false positives on the x-axis and misdetections on the y-axis. And so in black is the version or the of this model before any retuning, while the different lines here are just comparing to other established voice activity detection methods from the literature at the time. And in red here, we see the performance of the model after retuning these Gabor filters using this attentional feedback. So this framework was tested on a range of fairly challenging data sets, including a DARPA rat signals, which are conversational telephone speech with fairly low average SNR at roughly -2 decibels and some nonlinear distortion. So I'm just showing you basically the system performance with different types of data sets and different types of noises. And so we see overall, when you focus on the red line, which is this retuned model, that the model performs fairly well by simply adjusting this gain, retuning, and orientation of these mapping filters to adapt to different listening scenarios. So while the overall performance of the system does give us a sense of this, sort of that the system is performing reasonably well, we wanted to really get a better understanding of how attentional retuning is able to facilitate this process. So we looked at how the retuned model projects the incoming signal for both speech and non-speech. And so here what we're looking at is what we call a modulation profile, or effectively a form of two-dimensional Fourier transform of the time frequency spectrogram, where the x-axis shows temporal modulations or information of the dynamics of the signal along time, and the y-axis shows spectral modulations, or how the spectral energies are distributed in the signal. And so red regions correspond to peak energy, meaning that the retuned system basically concentrates energy of speech near very low spectral modulations. You see it here closer to the bottom, reflecting possibly the broad spectral profiles in speech, and also concentrates it near 4 to 8 hertz, both in positive and negative directions, which reflect sort of upwards and downward FM. So this is a far more concentrated representation of speech relative to what normal speech, or how the span of normal speech is before any retuning, which tends to be a little bit broader. So this retuning operation, by focusing on speech targets, the model basically concentrates the energy or sort of the filters to pick out mostly these most informative regions in speech signals. And so in contrast, we see that non-speech tends to cover other parts of this modulation profile. And in fact, to really get a better view of what's happening here, we can look at the difference between these two profiles. And what you can see here is that the attentional retuning is in fact highlighting the non-overlapping regions between these two classes, where speech lies and where non-speech lies, hence allowing the system to improve discriminability. Looking beyond the overall equal error rates results, we also wanted to get a better sense of what is achieved using this retuning process. And so here we're looking at the log likelihood ratios of speech and non-speech classes before any adaptation, shown here in the dashed lines, and after adaptation, shown with the solid lines, for an average noise condition of 0 decibels. And so what I wanted to draw your attention to is that histograms before attention tended to have very long tails, while attentional retuning seems to play a role of tightening these distributions. So we see similar patterns at different noise conditions, from +15 to -10 dB. And so originally, when we observed the data in brain recordings, our initial hypothesis was that attention could be moving the mean of the representations of different classes away from each other to improve discriminability. Instead, what we're discovering from this study is that there is an alternative interpretation to the results we see in the brain, specifically that attention results in more compact representation of the attended target, hence facilitating our ability to pick out a signal from other distractors. So meaning that our sensory filters are retuning on the fly to tighten up the variance of the embedding space rather than to move the means apart. And so by tightening these representations or these variants or giving us more compact mapping functions, it is also able to facilitate the process of directing our attentional spotlight on it. So moving on to another aspect of how attention manifests itself in the brain. And so this is another manifestation of how attention operates in the brain that complements this retuning mechanism that I just talked about, is attention acting as a gating mechanism. So specifically, as neural activity from brain regions emerges in response to a sound mixture, we see that neural activation undergoes an adaptive cooperation that fuses together channels that are temporally coherent with each other. So, and attention plays an important role in facilitating this gating. So we can think of this process as kind of a bottleneck or selection mechanism that changes the activity that gets passed from one stage to the next based on our memory of which sounds we are trying to pay attention to. So if we look at a network of multiple nodes, one way, sort of based on some studies that have explored this question, one way to think about a role of attention is that our memory or our priors about what sounds we're trying to pay attention to are used to basically selectively or gate which neurons or which nodes get their activity sort of further enhanced and passed along to the next stages. So we can think of it really not necessarily as a bottleneck operation, but more of a sort of selection or a gating process that sort of controls the propagation of information throughout the network. And there are two really important studies that I wanted to draw your attention to. So while not getting into really the details of experiments, there is really two studies that give us a better indication of how this role of attention really operates in biological networks. So the first study set out to investigate how acoustic features are bound together based on their temporal coherence. So this is a study that was done in human listeners. And the questions we really asked was, when we are trying to pay attention to, say, a female voice, and I tell you, pay attention to a pitch of, say, 200 hertz, for example, how do you use your prior memory to basically hone in on which frequencies you should be attending to? So how do you encode or modulate other channels away from 200 hertz that are really not necessarily under your direct attentional spotlight? Are you paying attention to also 400 hertz or 600 hertz, which tend to be harmonics of 200? And carry some of the formants of this female voice, but are not necessarily part of the instructions that you are provided. And basically what this study has found is that attention to a target feature enhances neural responses in the input that are coherent with it. So as our harmonics evolve as we talk, a number of sound patterns co-vary with, say, our pitch. Even if I were moving in the room, my spatial location will co-vary with my speech that I'm producing. And so those other features or those other channels, that other information in the brain is also being enhanced in conjunction with the sound feature that you're paying attention to by virtue of this idea of it being temporally coherent with it. The second study that I wanted to mention, again, without really getting into the details of the paradigm, explored the effects of attention on objects in our memory and basically showed that selective attention modulates our memory to further sharpens the representational precision with which objects are held in memory. So what we're basically seeing here is that this active process where, as we're paying attention, our representation or our memory of what it is we're paying attention to is being adapted also on the fly to further sharpen the precision of this representation and hence facilitate or help us perform the task. And so these are just but two of really many studies that reflect other aspects of how attention adapts processing in biological networks. So for the remainder of this talk, I will reflect on how these findings can translate into really impactful theoretical formulations in the context of an artificial network. So guided by these experimental results, we then asked how does the biological system leverage mechanisms of coherence-based fusion and self-guided tuning to allow us to focus on one sound class amidst other classes? So how would ideas of fusion and top-down self-correcting feedback facilitate selectively separating a sound from a mixture, paying attention to a sound, ignoring the others? So this is an infrastructure that we've been exploring in some recent work where we can modulate or we can manipulate these different ideas. So say we're listening to a musical piece and we want to pay attention to the drums. So one of the questions is, how does our knowledge of what a drum is and this ability to pay attention to the drum allow us to retune the processing pipeline to help us separate or focus on the sounds of the drums and ignore everything else? So we considered a fairly simple architecture where we can explore these ideas. So the first element that we wanted to incorporate in this architecture is one of the hallmarks of biological networks, and we know one of the basic representational principles in auditory cortex, which is using a distributed representation, using multiple parallel streams. So in other words, these are parallel but somewhat redundant representations of the same input from different vantage points. So as the input comes in, it is being represented along multiple resolutions, or each path here represents this signal from its own viewpoint or its own vantage point. So here we're not really focusing on the filters themselves, and we didn't really use pre-designed or parameterized filters like I presented earlier with Gabor filters. We're just gonna take a page out of the deep learning playbook and just basically used a simple trained feed-forward network with a sequence of filtering and pooling operations. So there's different degrees of pooling and upsampling procedures in each of these streams, and basically a number of filtering operations, but it's a fairly simple network. And so here, each stream basically is trained to reconstruct the spectrogram of the sound the system is listening to from its own perspective. So if I'm listening to the sound mixture, each of these streams tries to output its own representation of what the drums are. So each of these streams is trained independently without any crosstalk with the other stream. So obviously each stream operates within its own resolution, and so to speak, it does not really achieve perfect reconstruction, but basically strives to output the representation that is trying to encode from its own viewpoint. And so what this allows us to get is basically a redundant but somewhat complementary views of the same signal of interest. So to put this information together, we have an integrator path, which basically concatenates information across all parallel streams within a layer and outputs its own signal from its own vantage point. So basically integrating information across these three paths and then performing a simple filtering and pooling operator to, again, represent the signal or output the signal we're interested in from its own vantage point. So what is important to note here is that the system is really a fairly generalist system. It does not really know or use any higher level knowledge about the sound class or categories. When used for speech, it doesn't assume any prior knowledge of language, or when used with music, we're not assuming any higher level knowledge of musical syntax. This is really a fairly signal-driven representation, but that allows these kind of redundant representations or multi-resolution mappings. And so within this architecture, we now wanted to explore formulations of how attention can operate. So we wanted to explore this idea of gating using these, our knowledge or memory or priors of what sound we wanted to pay attention to. So if we look at the activation at the level of each stream, one interpretation of this attentional gating is effectively to use our knowledge of this target to guide which activations are further processed and which should be suppressed. And so this idea here is that by telling the system to pay attention to the drums or someone's voice, the system relies on some generic knowledge of what that sound class is, and it deploys its memory or its priors about the sound target to gauge which channels continue being active and how and which ones should be suppressed. So it is important to emphasize here that this memory of the target is not really a template. It's rather a latent representation that reflect higher level priors about the sound class. So these priors, O sub m, are then deployed in this fashion. We use this sort of nonlinear mapping function to apply this idea of coherence through this point by point, sorry, inner product through this sigmoid function. So basically, the outputs coming out, or the activations of a given set of nodes in each of these streams, are then gated using this simple operator here that deploys or uses the object memory priors that are trained as part of the system to further shape what information or what embeddings are further gated and then propagated to the rest of the system. So it's a fairly simple Hebbian rule to gate these stream outputs, but that really relies on this concept of coherence across the different channels. So this gating mechanism is then can be generalized. You know, it doesn't have to be in each of these one of these streams, but can be, because we're working with this distributed system, that affords us basically a distributed gating of this information flow. So this closely mimics experimental results that showed both distributed and hierarchical effects of retuning or attentional feedback to help emerge an increasingly distinct representation of the object of interest. So we incorporated basically this gating process at the level of both these local streams, but also at the level of these integrators and across different layers of this network. So finally, an element that we haven't incorporated yet is this self-supervised retuning, meaning using the system output to further retune these local memories in order to better capture the evolution or representation of the sound targets of interest, as well as changes to the ambient conditions. So while the idea of adaptive system parameters can be really costly in general, adjusting only the local memories allows us to achieve adaptive behavior during inference, really using limited amounts of data as the system generates its output. So the idea here is that as the system generates its output, it can use sort of its own errors in a sort of autocorrect mechanism to go back and feed back into these local memories and adjust them on the fly, allowing the system to really evolve with the changes in the listening condition or the environment. So we tested this idea for the task of sound separation, meaning given a noisy input, can we listen to sound X and ignore all the other sounds in the environment? But as I was emphasizing, we're really focusing here on a generalist system that can perform sound separation in a general sense. So we tested this architecture for both music separation and speech enhancement using the exact same architecture. The system really doesn't deploy, as I said, any higher level knowledge about language or musical syntax, but really just relies on its memories of what sound classes are of interest to it in order to help or guide how it retunes itself. So we tested this idea of retuning in a fairly shallow system. We only used 2 layers, though the basic principle can certainly be extended to deeper systems. And as a reminder, this is really not an end-to-end system per se. So each component of the system is trained independently. Each of these parallel streams is trained independently. And once the first layer streams are trained, they are then kept frozen and their output is passed to the next layers, which are again trained independently again. So we deliberately designed the system this way, as we're really not as interested in this end-to-end behavior, but we're really more interested in the operations of these individual modules as they come together and adapt to based on whatever conditions we're testing the system on. So taking a look at the performance of this system, first I'll focus on the music sound separation task. So as I described, this is a system that is designed to operate to pay attention to one or many sounds and using its memory of these sounds to parse out or to extract these signals. So these attentional tasks are done sequentially. So first the system is given a sound mixture and then asked to pay attention to, say, the drums, and then we can test it again and see how well it can pay attention to the bass or the vocals. And really paying attention from one task to the other are really done in an independent way. So this is really not a zero-sum game. We can listen briefly to how the system performs. I'm going to play you a little bit of this sound mixture. And so I can, for example, play an example of the drums. Or the bass. So here I'm showing you basically the overall performance of the system on the entire test data set and comparing it to the performance of 3 fairly state-of-the-art systems in the literature shown here in black. The numbers here are in signal to distortion ratio, so obviously higher is better. And it's basically showing the system performance on these different sound classes for these music mixtures, vocals, bass, drums, and other sounds. And in red here is this system with attentional retuning. And so we can see that the system is pretty much on par with many of these systems, though, you know, it doesn't perform as competitively on the bass or on other sounds. But I should point out here that this is a fairly shallow system consistent of basically these simple 2 layers compared to these other systems, which tend to be fairly deep and architectures with very large parameters spanning 10 or more layers. So taking a closer look at really the different components of the system or how it performs, I'm showing you here the same signal to distortion ratio on the y-axis, and I'm showing you the individual performance of individual streams in layer 1 and layer 2, and then the integrator stream in layer 1 and layer 1 plus layer 2, and the final performance of the system with retuning. And so on the left here is the performance of the system when it's attending to the drums, and on the right when it's attending to the bass. And so the important thing really I wanted to draw your attention to is that individual streams may not respond as well to a certain sound class. So we see, for example, here, this stream does not respond that much to drums, yet it contributes fairly well to the bass. But what is important here from this distributed architecture is that collectively, the distributed architecture does pretty well at attending to the sound of interest, even if its individual parts may not be equally informative. We can also gain a better insight onto how this self-guided retuning operates by looking at a spectrogram of a specific example. So what we see here in the top spectrogram in time and frequency is the clean vocals of a musical piece. And here in the second spectrogram, we see the mixture signal that was given as input to the system. So our goal is to pay attention to the vocals or extract the vocals from this mixture signal. And now what I'm showing you is how the system, what the output from the system is when it was paying attention to the vocals without the top-down attentional feedback or retuning of these memories, and with the attentional feedback. And so while the results are a little subtle, there are some interesting points to pay attention to. So for example, here, you see that the system has adapted. So without attention, the system seems to think basically that these kind of frequency channels are indicative or sort of commensurate with the presence of the vocals. And so you see here that when the vocals are absent, the system tends to confuse some of these frequency channels as being part of the vocals, even though they are not there. But with the attentional retuning, what the model is basically learning on the fly, that it adapts its memory to adjust the contribution of these frequency channels so that it does not perform these kinds of mistakes. And it basically adjusts to the fact that the background drums do share this profile frequency coverage with the vocals, and so the system needs to adapt to its presence to not confuse the two, the same frequency channel as belonging to one class versus the other. So finally, I wanted to show you the results of the system, the exact same architecture on speech enhancement. So basically, now we have the same architecture. The system is now trained to learn priors of speech as attentional target. And so what I'm showing you here is the performance of the system, again, in signal to distortion ratio on the y-axis. And on the x-axis here, I'm showing you the performance of different systems. So in different gray bars, we are looking at different systems from the literature, including a fairly recent generative adversarial system here. And the red bar is basically showing the proposed system, again, with just these 2 layers that was tested either on the timid database with some non-stationary backgrounds or in this plot on the right on speech data from the DCASE 2020 data set. So again, here we see that the system performs really far exceeding these other systems, even though it's a fairly, I will emphasize, a fairly basic system. And one of the key aspects here that we can see is that because of the non-stationary nature of many of the noises in these two data sets, the system is able to show this adaptation as it's listening to the speech, and the gating mechanisms allow the signal to really focus on the nodes or informative nodes as the signal is being processed to facilitate the enhancement of the speech signals relative to the background distortion. So I can again play you some examples here. So this is the noisy input or the sound mixture of speech and the background noise.
She had your dark suit and greasy wash water all year. Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
Oops. And this is what the system is able to output by paying attention to speech.
She had your dark suit and greasy wash water all year. Don't ask me to carry an oily rag like that.
And let's see, you can play a second example here.
Diversity of perception, yes. Diversity of fact, yes.
And this is the clean version that the signal is able to output.
Diversity of perception, yes. Diversity of fact, yes.
So we see that overall the system really is able to perform fairly well by paying attention to the speech sounds. And so to regroup, I really have emphasized how attention operates as this pervasive feedback that is present throughout the auditory system. It can retune parameters of the system on the fly to result in more compact representations of the sounds we're interested in. It can adjust the selection of which channels are informative, and it can sharpen or enhance the memory anchors that result in a self-correcting or continuous self-supervised tweaking of the system as we listen to sounds. So the picture really that emerges here is that of a continuously adaptive system that capitalizes on its imperfections or redundancies, so to speak, to cleverly deploy its computational resources to what is important. So that being said, I do need to put in a word of caution. So selective attention is not really a unidirectional or monolithic process. So attentional feedback has to always balance some conflicting goals. On the one hand, we want to pay attention to someone's voice. We're having a conversation with a friend at a cafe. We're trying to pay attention to that person's voice. But there may be sounds in the environment that are trying to grab our attention in what we refer to as stimulus guided salience. So while we may be, as I said, trying to pay attention to a voice amidst a whole set of outer voices or outer sounds, our attentional control is not fully in our hands. And so some sounds in the environment can grab our attention if they are salient enough. And so based on the conspicuity of sounds in the environment, if an alarm were to go off right now, we will all pay attention to it, regardless of whether, we're trying to follow what I'm saying or whatever else is happening around us. So this is a topic that I haven't really touched on in this talk, but is important to keep in mind. I wanted to just point out that in a recent study, we've looked at how the brain changes its response based on what we're paying attention to. And so what, on the one hand, what I'm showing you here on the left are the kind of effects that I've been mentioning throughout this talk, that basically our brain enhances, so we see the enhancement in red here, enhances the neural encoding of target sounds that we're interested here. But at the same time, if there is a distracting sound in the background, something that is salient enough, as I said, an alarm, somebody's phone starts ringing, we see this really profound suppression of our ability to encode the sounds we're paying attention to in a way that reflects that something else that is deemed even more important can grab our attention, albeit momentarily. So this push-pull effects of attention, while rather effortless in our everyday communication, are really at the core of what makes cognitive control a fascinating problem to explore. So as we think about the future of many technologies, from smart speakers to hearing prosthetics to professional surveillance and navigation systems, we have to remember that everyday communication may seem effortless, but it's really this amazingly complex feat. And systems have to evolve past this task-driven constructs to be in more adaptive, abstract, self-guided behavior behavior and learning as we learn more about how our brain is able to evolve and perform many tasks with this seamless ease. So finally, I want to obviously take this opportunity to thank a lot of very talented students and postdocs who have done pretty much all of the work that I've presented here, as well as thank a lot of the funding sources that have supported us on this work. And I thank you all for your attention.
Okay, Mounya. We will do the usual thing which we do here. I will take the questions from the floor, and Honza will take the questions, whatever people send in. And in panic, I realized terrible thing. When I'm sitting here and moderating, I will not be able to ask the question, I guess. But we will meet each other, right, soon. So, hopefully. Any question? There is one, as usual, in the front.
Always a question ready. I have a question about training to train. In fact, there is a phase in machine learning where you adjust weights. It's during training. And you do this by computing a Jacobian, inversion of a Jacobian. And so for people doing one-shot learning, in fact, the key feature is to memorize the Jacobian. So it's memorizing how to train to train. Yep. And so it could be a way also to somehow understand how brain systems are able to adjust so rapidly to an input stimuli. So most of the time we throw away, in fact, the during training, after training, for inference, we just give the network, but not the Jacobian or the way the Jacobian has been adjusted. Do you think there are any evidence even in the brain system that such an information is preserved?
I think, I mean, that's one way to look at it. I don't actually disagree with this idea because the kind of changes that I talked about in these experiments are really a form of, rapid changes. These are not really the learning phase of the system. We're not talking about a young system. We're talking about an adult system that just changes its representation on the fly. And so I think the analogy of having these kind of, as you said, as sort of as stored representation of the Jacobian as part of what you learn about the task, it could be valid. I don't know that there is clear evidence of what exactly is learned that the brain uses as its sort of error signal to guide these changes. So that's something that I don't know that there's any studies that have been able to really pinpoint the nature of that. But I think an interpretation based on how you talked about this sort of train to train kind of idea is certainly valid. But there is few studies that are now exploring sort of the nature of what exactly the signal stores in order to guide these kinds of adaptations. But the jury is still out on that.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from the remote participants. Mm-hmm. So the first one was from Neeraj Sharma from Bangalore. And the question is, why will the neuron spend energy to adapt when there are other neurons which are already tuned to the frequency of interest?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the modeling work that the study that I chose to share about these Gabor filters, the reason we were interested in doing that analysis because we could control each of these filters sort of one at a time. And so the short answer to that question is because having many neurons that respond nearby may increase the variance as we saw sort of in those, for example, posteriors that I showed you. So one answer to this question is by focusing the nearby neurons on the target or the frequency that you are interested in, you're just reducing the variance of the model or the representation. And so that just facilitates discrimination. And I can tell you from other work that I haven't talked about here that generally these kind of retuning shows its benefit mostly in the very low SNR conditions. So in quiet, you don't really see a huge advantage to this retuning business. It performs as well as what the regular or the baseline system would do. You only see its benefit in terms of robustness, where the interference between the signal of interest, let's say speech, and noise gets greater And so that variance control becomes more important.
Do I see right? Nobody has any questions? So in that case, I will take one, I mean, if I may. If I understand well, Mounya, I know I'm an engineer and you are half engineer, right? What you are suggesting here, when we are training the system, we are changing the model. That's the way we are training the system. But you are telling us, don't do it, change the data, which is, of course, a terrible thing to do if you think about it. I mean, you know, data is sacred, right? But we can do it, obviously, in a brain. So I want to make sure that I heard it well. And you say, there is a model there, but you can pick up the data which fit the model better.
Well, I guess one way to interpret what I said is if you have a sort of a more abstract representation of your data, then you're not going to be as wedded to your data as you think you are. So the idea here is by getting that sort of more abstract representation. So it is still data driven, but not as tightly linked to the data. And so by having the sort of the model behind the data is what you really is learning, then you're able to sort of move along with what things are happening around you in a much more flexible way than you being wedded to the data.
But you are saying don't use the data which don't fit my model. That I almost like that. Maybe that's what I hear.
No, I would not. No, I wouldn't push it that far. I don't think that's a correct interpretation. I think. You know, the word model here, so there is an aspect of this when we talk about the brain that there is intention. So that's what we call sort of the task. You know, you want to listen to me talking, so that's your part of what is controlling your model is your intention.
Okay.
That there is the other part, which is if your cell phone starts ringing now, then that might actually repurpose what your model is. So it's not so much that you're choosing the data to fit your model, but yes, you're trying to find the middle ground between what you're trying to listen to, which is your internal model, and what the data outside. So it's really a balance. It's not really a, you know, just all data driven.
So whatever we do, I mean, we need to have some kind of error criterion. I think it's related to Gerald's question. How do I know how I can do whatever you said we should be doing? I mean, what is it that I'm optimizing?
Well, it is, again, a combination, I think, of the two things. You are optimizing, there is, sort of, I imagine this as having two inputs to this system. So there is the data from the outside, and then there is the control signal from the inside. That control signal is not data driven. That is your independent, you know, sort of, I don't know what's the right word, right, sort of goal that you're trying to control. So, so you're trying to learn a way to flexibly switch or balance between these two things. That's why you have to have that flexibility to do the retuning as needed, because those two things are not always aligned. And so if you walk into a noisier room versus a quieter room, it's not, you know, there is a balance, there's a dramatic change in the data, but maybe the goal there is still the same. You're just sort of balancing that. But then if you change your mind, you don't want to listen to what's happening in the room, then the data may still be there, but your goal is different. So you need to be able to, you know, maybe storing this, the expression of the Jacobian is one way to think about it, but you really have to have the flexibility to, you know, to train the sort of, to retrain the model. But the word training, I think, is a little dramatic in this context, because you see that the brain is really much more fast at doing this retuning and then settling back on a baseline system. So I don't want to use the word train in a sort of more forceful way to be overinterpreted.
Okay, I have to give a chance to people.
Yeah, there's some more questions came on the online platform. So I because we don't have much time, I will take the liberty to choose. And I think one of the nice questions from Erfan Lowaini from Edinburgh, Scotland. And he asked about the difference between the biological system and a DNN in terms of that the DNN is trained based on the output, it adapts on that, and whether this is plausible in the biological system, or whether in the biological system there is some supervision based on at different levels.
So, this sort of, I think, maybe touches a little bit on another question about this concept of backpropagation in the brain and whether we think backprop happens in the brain in terms of controlling the error signal. And sort of biologically, I think there is some argument against the idea of backpropagation in terms of having synaptic updates, sort of using feedback connections from neighboring neurons. However, I think at a high level, we can think of them in parallel, in sort of, similar ways. There are some similarities in concept. So you have your output that basically guides or decides that you have generated an error, and that can be thought of as the way to sort of adjust the system. I think the difference that I want to really emphasize here is I haven't talked about anything, and this is outside my area of expertise, which is training a new system, like a sort of a brain, like a developmental sort of we're talking about children or young systems. What I'm talking about here is a fully trained system, and we're talking about the ability to retune the system as it interacts with the environment and changes its goals. So in that sense, the word, I think, backpropagation or sort of doing the adaptation will need to be guided by sort of a higher level feedback. And so in that sense, you can argue it's different than how a DNN, or at least the traditional way or how DNNs are implemented, go about doing or solving this task.
Okay, thank you. So one last one
Sure.
from Roger Moore from Sheffield. Hi, Roger. The question is whether it is true that the feedback process introduces some stability issues, and if yes, how do you handle them?
Yes, so certainly this is, I think, one of the open questions, is the sort of how does the system balance staying stable but still being able to adapt? And so, there has been a few studies. This is still a very open field, and I think a very exciting one, both for studying the brain but also computationally. How do you allow a system to be flexible but it's still not sort of get off the rails? And so, yes, feedback, I think that's one of the biggest dangers of it. And sometimes you see evidence of that in the brain, that we actually feel that we're not in control of what we're paying attention to. But in general, there is a much more sort of nuanced notion of how this adaptation changes our behavior. But basically, the short answer is we don't really understand how that balance of feedback still maintains a stable sensory representation, and it's, I think, still an open question.
Yeah, we need to learn how to learn. Okay, I think we unfortunately have to stop because we could keep you another hour easily, as you can see. But I think that we have to close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.